Chuvalo Mark Ferrell felt a storm of disbelief and anger as he reflected on the events that had turned his life upside down. For years, he had built something with his own hands, his own vision, and his own sweat. A restaurant empire he believed he founded, nurtured, and expanded. The very heart of his dreams and the legacy he intended to leave behind, only to watch it slip through his fingers, under circumstances he swore were unjust. He had been married to Kelli Ferrell, later Kelli Potter, a woman who became a household name on Real Housewives of Atlanta in its 16th season. And together they had seemingly shared both life and business. Yet Chuvalo claimed the reality of their partnership was far from what the public saw. He alleged that he was the sole founder of Nana's Chicken-N-Waffles, registering the business under his name, funding the initial location entirely, and carrying the responsibilities of all operations and expansions through 2022, pouring himself into every detail while navigating a marriage and a partnership that he now believed had been poisoned by deception. The betrayal, as he described it in a federal lawsuit filed on October 27, went beyond divorce or disagreement. It was a campaign, a calculated effort by Potter and officials in Rockdale County, including Janice Morris, the Superior Court clerk, to strip him of his business, his home, and his constitutional rights. He claimed that what unfolded was a series of civil rights violations, false imprisonment, and systemic misconduct designed to destroy him and transfer his empire into the hands of his former wife. The lawsuit detailed what he called a multi-year pattern of fraud, perjury, theft, administrative collusion, and intentional defamation, describing a relentless series of attacks on his property, reputation, and livelihood from February 2022 through at least August 2025. Chuvalo alleged that despite returning the money he had withdrawn from a joint business account almost 2 years prior, he was jailed in 2024 for over 40 days, accused of misappropriating funds that he had already restored, a punishment fueled by what he described as misleading representations from Potter and her attorney, disregarding verified bank statements and records proving his innocence. The complaint also accused Potter and her attorney of falsifying documents, including a lease for a second restaurant location, and claimed that Rockdale County Superior Court Judge Nancy Bills unlawfully compelled him to transfer ownership of a food truck held solely in his name under threat of additional jail time. Morris, the clerk, was alleged to have used her position to advance filings and judicial orders that favored Potter, often ignoring procedural defects or due process, while publicly promoting Potter's business interests to Chuvalo's detriment, revealing a personal and professional entanglement that interfered with fair judicial outcomes. Chuvalo and his attorneys described a man stripped of everything he built, a victim of administrative failures and deliberate manipulation, now fighting not only to reclaim his business and home, but also to restore his reputation, filing for $200 million in damages, attorney's fees, and any relief the court deemed appropriate, while also filing a related defamation lawsuit against Bravo TV and NBCUniversal for allegedly airing false narratives that harmed both his reputation and business interests. Chuvalo Mark Ferrell could still feel the weight of the courtroom pressing down on him, a place where the law was supposed to protect him, but, in his view, had betrayed him. The memories of being jailed for more than 40 days in 2024 haunted him, a punishment for taking money out of a joint account he had helped manage, money he claimed he had withdrawn out of concern over how his former wife, Kelli Potter, was spending it. He insisted he had returned the funds almost 2 years before his imprisonment, yet the court, according to his lawsuit, accepted false representations from Potter and her attorney, ignoring bank statements and verified records proving the money had been restored. The injustice he described was staggering. He was forced to surrender assets under duress. He lost control of his own home, all the property inside it, and ownership of the very business he had built from the ground up. His attorneys detailed what they called a calculated multi-year effort to strip him of everything he had earned, every document falsified, every filing advanced in Potter's favor, every court decision tainted by bias or collusion. Even the food truck he owned outright, a symbol of his independent effort and entrepreneurial spirit, was seized under threat of more jail time. Chuvalo's life, he claimed, had been turned upside down not by chance or bad luck, but by a deliberate campaign to remove him from the very empire he had created. He described the emotional toll of watching the business he had founded flourish under his former wife's name, while he was left to fight in court for recognition of his contributions, and the public narrative portrayed him as the villain, an impression that compounded his sense of injustice and humiliation. The alleged misconduct extended beyond his personal loss. It reached into the very structure of Rockdale County's judicial administration, with the Superior Court clerk accused of using her position to favor Potter's interests, promoting her business publicly while obstructing Chuvalo's attempts to protect his property and rights. The lawsuit painted a picture of systemic failure, an environment where bias and personal relationships dictated outcomes instead of law and fairness. Chuvalo's attorneys said the case was about more than money or property. It was about rights, accountability, and the ability of one man to defend himself against a network of people who allegedly colluded to undermine him. LaToya Francis Williams, his lead attorney, called it an unprecedented violation of constitutional protections. A man jailed for a debt that never existed, forced to surrender assets under pressure, and deprived of fundamental civil rights, all while false narratives aired on television damaged his public image. Chuvalo's defamation claim against Bravo TV and NBCUniversal sought to address the harm caused by portrayals that he and his team claimed were inaccurate and damaging, stories that painted him as less than the founder and operator of the business he built, narratives that threatened not only his livelihood, but also his credibility and personal identity. He described sleepless nights, constant legal battles, and the crushing stress of watching opportunities slip through his fingers as he fought to reclaim his name, his home, and his business. Every motion filed, every court date attended, every attorney consulted represented another day in a relentless fight for justice. The lawsuit described losses that went far beyond financial damage, extending into Chuvalo's reputation, personal well-being, and the very foundation of his life. It was a narrative of betrayal, struggle, and endurance. A man standing against institutions, individuals, and media forces, determined to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his and to reveal the truth behind a story that the public only partially understood. As he navigated these complex legal battles, Chuvalo remained committed to exposing what he viewed as corruption, collusion, and deliberate misconduct that had upended his life, seeking restitution, accountability, and acknowledgement of the years he devoted to building something that others sought to claim as their own. The emotional toll was enormous. The business he had started with his own hands, the home he had worked to maintain, the reputation he had cultivated over decades, all of it threatened. And yet, through every hearing, every filing, every obstacle, he persisted, driven by the conviction that the law, when properly applied, would eventually recognize the truth and restore what had been taken from him. Chuvalo Mark Ferrell felt the weight of years pressing down on him as he prepared to tell the final chapter of his story, a chapter filled with betrayal, loss, and the unrelenting pursuit of justice. And every memory he carried seemed to merge into a single, overwhelming current of emotion that reminded him of all he had endured and all he still had to fight for. He thought back to the moment when his life began to unravel, the moment when he realized that the business he had built with his own hands, the very restaurant chain that had become his passion and his legacy, was being challenged and undermined in ways that he had never imagined. A calculated effort to strip him of the fruits of his labor and to distort the story of who he was and what he had accomplished. And it filled him with a mix of anger, disbelief, and a deep, aching sense of injustice. The days he spent in court were long and draining, each session a reminder of how fragile his world had become and how easily a system meant to protect people could be manipulated by those with influence and connections. And he remembered the moment when the judge ordered him to surrender his food truck, a symbol of his independence and creativity, under threat of additional jail time, and the shame, frustration, and helplessness he felt in that instant threatened to overwhelm him. Yet he drew strength from the knowledge that he had worked tirelessly for every piece of property, every dollar, and every opportunity that he had earned. Chuvalo reflected on the betrayal he experienced from someone he had once trusted implicitly, Kelli Potter, his former wife, whose public image as a television personality and co-founder of Nana's Chicken-N-Waffles masked the allegations he now brought forward. The allegations of falsified documents, manipulated records, and systemic collusion with officials who were supposed to administer justice fairly, and he could not help but feel that the entire system had conspired against him, turning his accomplishments into grounds for attack and his efforts into reasons for punishment, all while the world outside only saw fragments of the truth and constructed a narrative that left him misunderstood and maligned. Every detail of the lawsuit told a story of relentless struggle. The return of funds that had been taken from a joint account, only to be used against him later as evidence of wrongdoing. The falsification of lease agreements and business records meant to justify the transfer of ownership from him to Potter. The administrative decisions of the Superior Court clerk, Janice Morris, whose actions he alleged consistently favored Potter's interests and compromised his ability to defend himself, creating an environment in which due process was ignored and bias dictated outcomes. Chuvalo's attorneys described this as more than a personal dispute. It was an assault on his civil rights, a violation of the constitutional guarantees that should have protected him from false imprisonment, property seizure, and defamation. And he felt the magnitude of what he had endured acutely as he recounted the days he spent in jail, the nights he lay awake worrying about the security of his home, and the humiliation of seeing his reputation tarnished by claims that ignored the truth of his actions and his intentions. He reflected on the countless hours of work he had poured into Nana's Chicken-N-Waffles, opening and managing locations, expanding operations, and ensuring that the business maintained its quality, reputation, and profitability, and how each success had been overshadowed by legal battles and false accusations, leaving him to fight not only for his business, but for recognition of the role he had played in creating something of lasting value. The defamation lawsuit he filed against Bravo TV and NBCUniversal was another layer of the struggle, an attempt to reclaim his narrative and assert that the stories portrayed on television had damaged his professional and personal reputation, influencing public perception in a way that unfairly cast him as less than the founder and operator of the business he had devoted his life to. Chuvalo thought about the emotional toll of seeing his name and accomplishments questioned on national television, how it compounded the stress of the legal battles he was already facing, and how it created an additional challenge in convincing both the court and the public of the truth he had lived and the integrity with which he had built his business. He remembered the sleepless nights spent reviewing records, coordinating with attorneys, and strategizing for court appearances, the frustration of seeing evidence ignored, and the constant pressure of trying to protect his assets, his home, and his dignity, while others manipulated the system to their advantage. And through it all, he drew upon a resilience forged from years of facing obstacles, adversity, and betrayal, a determination to reclaim what was rightfully his, and a refusal to let injustice define the rest of his life. Each day brought new challenges, from complex legal filings to procedural disputes, each one a reminder of how high the stakes had become and how relentless the opposition was in pursuing their version of events. But Chuvalo's focus remained on the truth, on proving that he had been the sole founder of the restaurant chain, the person responsible for its operations and expansion, and the one wronged by a combination of personal betrayal and administrative misconduct. He visualized a future where his name would be restored, where the courts would recognize the full extent of his contributions, and where the defamation claims would correct the false narratives that had cast shadows over his reputation. And he felt a spark of hope, a belief that perseverance and evidence would ultimately vindicate him and allow him to reclaim both his legacy and his peace of mind. Chuvalo considered the impact on his personal life as well. The strain on family, friendships, and personal well-being that accompanied prolonged legal battles, the emotional exhaustion of constantly defending oneself against allegations and procedural obstacles, and the way the uncertainty of each court decision weighed on him, creating a relentless psychological burden that few outside of his situation could understand. Despite these challenges, he drew strength from the knowledge that he had fought honestly, worked tirelessly, and remained committed to the truth, understanding that justice was not always immediate, but that persistence, documentation, and unwavering commitment to one's principles could eventually bring recognition and restoration. He reflected on the symbolism of the assets that had been taken from him, the home he had built, the business he had founded, and the property that represented years of effort, seeing each not just as material possessions, but as extensions of his identity, of his dedication, and of the life he had meticulously constructed, and the violation of losing them, even temporarily, struck at the core of who he was and the sense of stability he had fought to maintain. Chuvalo also considered the broader implications of his case, how it represented struggles that others might face when systems fail, when relationships become entangled with legal processes, and when public perception is manipulated to favor one side over another, and he hoped that the outcome of his lawsuits would not only restore his personal rights, but also serve as a warning that truth and fairness must remain central in both business and legal realms. The emotional weight of these realizations was immense, yet he persisted, channeling frustration into determination, despair into strategy, and anxiety into meticulous preparation, each step designed to counteract the injustices he claimed to have suffered and to reclaim not only the tangible aspects of his life, but also his sense of agency and self-respect. He envisioned walking into court, presenting evidence that could not be ignored, showing clearly that he had founded, funded, and operated the restaurant chain, that he had returned disputed funds years before they were used as grounds for incarceration, and that the falsified documents and biased administrative actions had contributed directly to the losses he endured. And in this vision, he saw a future where truth prevailed. His reputation was restored, and his rights were fully recognized. He reflected on the irony of being vilified on television while simultaneously fighting real battles in court, how public perception often diverged sharply from reality, and how the need to protect both his financial interests and his reputation had become intertwined in ways that demanded extraordinary resilience, strategic thinking, and emotional fortitude. Chuvalo imagined the moment when, after years of struggle, the courts might acknowledge the errors, misconduct, and deliberate actions that had harmed him, and how the relief, vindication, and restoration of his name and property would feel. A culmination of perseverance, courage, and a refusal to allow injustice to go unchallenged. He thought about the sacrifices he had made, the personal costs of long hours, strained relationships, and emotional fatigue, and how each of those sacrifices had contributed to building a foundation strong enough to withstand the challenges he faced. He reflected on the journey of reclaiming not only his business but his narrative, the story of a man who had built an empire with integrity and vision, yet found himself battling the very systems meant to protect fairness, and how his fight had become about more than money or property. It had become a fight for truth, dignity, and the principle that hard work and honesty should be recognized and respected, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. Every setback, every procedural hurdle, every false accusation had been a test of his determination, and through each test, he reinforced his commitment to pursue justice, reclaim what was his, and ensure that the truth of his contributions and rights would not be silenced. Chuvalo's vision of victory extended beyond personal restoration. It was about accountability, about setting a precedent, about showing that no one's rights should be violated through collusion, bias, or misrepresentation, and that those who manipulate systems to their advantage should face consequences. The weight of this mission energized him even as it exhausted him, giving focus to every action, every legal strategy, and every carefully documented piece of evidence, because he understood that persistence, precision, and clarity were the only ways to navigate the labyrinthine legal and public landscape that had turned against him. Chuvalo's story, as captured in the lawsuit and the accompanying defamation claims, was not just a tale of loss, it was a testament to human resilience, the capacity to fight against overwhelming odds, and the determination to reclaim not only material possessions, but also identity, reputation, and dignity. And as he prepared to continue his legal battle, he knew that each day brought him closer to the possibility of resolution, vindication, and the restoration of what had been taken from him, and that his perseverance might also serve as an example to others facing similar battles, inspiring them to hold fast to truth and justice, even when systems seemed stacked against them. He reflected on the years spent building a business from nothing, the sacrifices made, the nights without sleep, the challenges faced and overcome, the moments of doubt and fear, and how all of those experiences had prepared him for the fight he was now engaged in, giving him the resilience to continue, the patience to endure, and the focus to pursue his ultimate goal of reclaiming his name, his business, and his life. And in that reflection, he felt a quiet strength, a deep determination, and an unshakable belief that the truth, when fully revealed, would prevail.